Hi and welcome back to my channel. This is A Year in Books with Zoe and I am of course your host Zoe. Today I want to look at some of the books that I read in my Shakespeare class in my last semester of college. The class was Shakespeare and Race. We read 5 Shakespeare texts and we kind of examined the racial aspects of them. For me, this really caused me to look at Shakespeare differently. In high school I read Romeo and Juliet, I had read Othello, Hamlet, and then I was in A Midsummer Night's Dream when I was a younger girl, when I was a kid. And so I kind of always viewed Shakespeare through these like rose-colored glasses. I thought he was amazing. I think a big of that is that he's really hyped up as a writer. And so after this class, I've kind of wondered, is that really fair? I think he has his moments of good writing, but I think a big part of the hype is kind of like the Old English. Of course, that's like up to anyone's opinion about what they think. So anyways, in this class, we're looking at the racialized aspects of Shakespeare plays. One thing to be really cognizant of is that during this time, the English people were really trying to figure out their own identities, their own race, and kind of define that against other people. When we're trying to figure out who we are, we often will look at who we are not. And so we otherize other groups of people in order to define ourselves. And then there's also this aspect that some people do believe that Shakespeare was kind of going for social justice at the time, I guess would be a good way to explain it, where he's trying to question the values of society at the time by kind of playing with the racial structure, the class structure, the gender structure. I personally find issue with that because you really have to consider what the audience would be seeing, and I personally believe that the audience would see this as kind of like a justification of the racial, social, class, gender structures that they already believed in, and so the comedy, I think, would just validate their feelings already. But it's up to anyone's interpretation. That is simply what I saw. So I want to talk about the first book that we read in this class, and that is The Merchant of Venice. This was the first time that I read The Merchant of Venice. I didn't really know anything about it going into it. My professor gave us like a content warning that it was very anti-Semitic, and I wasn't ready for that. This book is essentially just anti-Semitism. We see the 2 Jewish characters, Shylock and Jessica, belittled for being Jewish. Shylock is spat on in the street. He is held to much higher standards than his Christian counterparts, and he is forced to convert, despite the fact that it's pretty apparent in the book that you can't really convert from Judaism to Christianity because you will always be a Jew by blood. So that's definitely something I will say to keep in mind. If you're going to read this book, be very aware of that. It is very anti-Semitic. I would argue that the basis of the play is just to be anti-Semitic with some like things happening along with it. So I would say there's 2 stories of this play. I'd say the main story is of Portia and Bassanio. So Portia is this heiress, and she is looking for a husband, and her father has left these boxes that men are supposed to choose from so they can see if they can marry her. One of the first men that we see that she is giving the test is the Prince of Morocco, and he is the only black character in this play. And Portia does not want him to pick correctly because she does not want to marry a black man. Even though he says, you know, like, my skin is not defining me, like, it's just because I'm closer to the sun. She doesn't care. She doesn't want to marry a black man. Also, keep in mind that at the time, there were no Black actors, there were no Jewish actors. The Prince of Morocco would have been played by a white man in blackface, and Shylock would have been played by a white man using prosthetics that made him appear to be what the English at the time thought Jewish people looked like. So think racist stereotypes would be what we were looking at. And so then we have Bassanio, who is friends with Antonio, who is a merchant in Venice. And Bassanio asks Antonio for money so that he can go and pursue Portia. Antonio has to borrow money from Shylock, who I mentioned before is one of the Jewish characters. And Shylock is like, you spit on me in the street, so why are you approaching me now? And they're still insulting Shylock as they're asking him for money. And so Shylock tells them, all right, I'll lend you some money, but if you don't pay it back, I want some of Antonio's flesh. Which, let's examine that. That is extremely anti-Semitic. The idea that, Jewish people are cannibalistic and bloodthirsty is inherently linked to that part of the play. And it's reinforcing that idea that there's something very different about Jewish people from Christians. And so he goes and pursues Portia, and Portia likes him back. There you go. And then you have Jessica, who is the daughter of Shylock, and Lorenzo and Lancelot. Lancelot is a former employee of Shylock. At the beginning of the play, we see him leave Shylock because he believes being the servant of a Jew is bad. And Jessica is also very against her Jewish heritage. She believes that if she marries a Christian, she can leave being Jewish behind and become a Christian herself. And so there's kind of that conflict throughout the story is, can Jessica truly become a Christian despite being Jewish by blood? And Lancelot says no. He tells her, nope, you can't be Christian. If that could happen, then everybody would be Christian. And her own husband, maybe at the time, maybe still fiance, Lorenzo, questions her humanity at the end when she doesn't want to give in to him when they're listening to a song. He says even animals would do this, so what's wrong with you? And that's basically the plotline of that part of the story. We return back to Portia, Antonio, Bassanio. Antonio doesn't end up being able to pay the debt to Shylock, and Shylock brings him to court. Portia pretends to be a judge and is holding Shylock to this higher standard when Shylock is demanding this portion of flesh. Like I said, very anti-Semitic. She holds Shylock to this very high standard. She questions whether he can even be considered a citizen and have rights in Venice, which it seems like no, he can't. And then he is forcefully converted at the end. But like I said, it seems that in this play, conversions don't really work that way. So he's kind of in this limbo state where he can't be Jewish anymore, but he also can't be Christian. So this play is very complicated. There's a lot going on with it. And it's just so anti-Semitic. There's a lot of questions I think that were probably going on in the minds of people at the time, but the bottom line is that it's just a really anti-Semitic play. And I would really question people who would want to be performing it today because of the anti-Semitism present. So that's all I say for that play. We also read Othello, which I really enjoyed reading it when I was in high school, but looking at it through this lens of, race changes the way you view the play. For those of you that don't know, Othello is, this great general who's fought in all these wars, and he falls in love with Desdemona, who is this white woman who's considered to be very pure in society. And his second in command, Iago, begins this plot to try to convince Othello that Desdemona is cheating on him. The play begins with Iago trying to convince Desdemona's father of how horrible Othello is. He's telling him, your daughter is being, having relations with a Barbary horse, I think is what the term used. But essentially just using all these animalistic terms to talk about Othello. And then you kind of see Othello, and he's very different from how Iago has described him. He's very proper, very gentlemanly, well-liked, clearly, because he's this general, but he gets put in this position where he has to beg for, forgiveness, to be seen by this council of white men, so that he isn't punished for marrying a white woman. So then they move to a new location where he's positioned in the military. And that's when Iago decides to start his plot to make Othello believe that his wife is cheating on him. And Othello is already very insecure about it. He knows his position in society, and he understands that there's an issue with him and Desdemona being together. And so he understands that, and so he's already self-conscious, already nervous about that. He's already self-conscious about his own place in society. He understands that as a black man, he's in a very delicate situation, and Iago takes advantage of that and is able to convince him that Desdemona is cheating on him. And it eventually leads to, I don't want to ruin the story, even though this play has been out for a very, very long time. It leads to his downfall, essentially, because he does believe that Desdemona was cheating. Desdemona was not cheating, but the story is, the downfall of a great man. And in my opinion, I think Shakespeare's audience would view it as a black man who rose to power being put back in his rightful place, because he got to this high position. He married a white woman, and that is very much not able to fit in with how society is structured, and he has to be put back in his place, or the social structure is wrong. And so I think this play helps to show that the thought process of where black people should be socially is correct, because look, Othello, leaned into his, nature, and followed all the stereotypes that they believed a black man to have, and it was his downfall. So that's all I'll say about Othello. I think it's actually a very, very good work. There is that whole racist aspect. I mean, that's a big thing, really. It's a big thing that can't be ignored whenever you're performing the play. And then I'll also say that we read American Moor, which talks about how difficult it is for a black man to play Othello, especially when your director is a white man telling you what to do, who does not understand the situation that Othello is in. So I do recommend American Moor. If you read Othello, I would say read American Moor as well, because it'll give you a good idea of what the experience is like for a black man to play Othello, which I think is really important because this play is still happening, and Othello is considered to be one of the dream classical roles for black men in theater. And I don't know that that's necessarily fair. Let's see. We also read The Comedy of Errors, which is essentially a who is who mishap. You have give me a second. Let's get to this character list, because it's been a while since I've read it. You have Antipholus of Syracuse and Antipholus of Ephesus, and you have Dromio of Syracuse and Dromio of Ephesus. So the Antipholi are brothers, are twins, who were separated on a shipwreck, and then the Dromios are also twins, but the Dromios are slaves to the Antipholi. Antipholi's father bought them from their mother and then gave them to his sons as slaves. And so a lot of the comedy in this play has to do with the Dromios being beaten. And so the Dromios talk a lot about how the only thing that, because they are white also, just like the Antipholi, the only thing that distinguishes them as slaves is the physical markings of the beatings that they receive. And so they talk about that. And so essentially the first Antipholus goes into the city where the second Antipholus is, and they get confused because they don't realize that there's another one there, even though the first one is searching for his brother. So Antipholus's wife, Ephesus' wife, Adriana, mistakes Antipholus of Syracuse for her husband and becomes very upset with him. The Dromios keep going back and forth between the different Antipholi and not realizing, and so they're getting beat by all these different people for the confusion. And eventually, everything gets righted. But a big thing here is looking at class system and also looking at the class system here and kind of like the abuse that certain people are able to receive. It's kind of terrible. You won't see this play many times because, again, the whole premise is that they're being beaten, and that's the joke. It's very confusing. It's a very confusing play. The story isn't that great, I'll say. And it's basically just like, let's beat our slaves. That's like the whole story. And then like the Antipholi get a happy ending where, the one of Ephesus gets his wife Adriana, and then the one of Syracuse gets the sister of Adriana, and like they're all happy and their parents are reunited. And then the Dromios, it's like, oh, I have you, but we're still slaves, so we're still gonna be beaten. Now there's more people who are gonna beat us, basically. Yeah. So definitely, I didn't really like this one, to be completely honest. All right, and we also read Titus Andronicus, which features, one thing, let me return to the Merchant of Venice. So the Merchant of Venice does have a speech that Shylock gives. Again, that's the Jewish character, where he says, like, am I not different? Are we not the same? If I bleed and you bleed, etc. And so some people will think that that's the reason that this is kind of like a social justice play, because it's like, we're the same. We're both people. We feel the same things. We experience the same things. So like, why can't I be treated correctly? But then he's still treated badly. Everyone ignores what he says.